So while he's plugging that in, Shaun's the general manager of Laffort North America, and his knowledge and approach to finding solutions is integral. It's really important to what makes it fun to work at Laffort and to work with Shaun. We have a lot of really great time brainstorming new experiments, and I always enjoy drinking espresso with this guy. Hopefully after the virus has subsided and things begin to normalize in whichever way that happens, we'll be hitting up the boardroom and fleshing out some more experiments. If you have any experiments, or if you want to do experiments, he and I can help you do some validation procedures in your winery. Shaun, you got the new mic in?
Check. Does that sound any better?
Oh, that's perfect. That's great. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shaun Richardson, and he will give a talk about botrytis and mitigating rot in your wine.
And actually, I am going to include heat stroke as well.
Okay.
So we'll do botrytis and heat stroke. So first up, thank you, Daniel, for the introduction, and thank you so far to the speakers that I've heard, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I'm looking forward to the next all the next presentations as well. Daniel said, I'm Shaun Richardson. I'm the GM with Laffort USA. I'm going to talk about botrytis and heat stroke, and really, I'm going to talk about just the damage and how to mitigate the damage in the winery. Mold and sunburn, all those wonderful things. I think I have possibly the worst pictures in these presentations, and I have a lot of them. Sorry about that, but we'll get through them all. And one thing, of course, you have to remember that not only are both of these occurrences happening more frequently due to the unpredictable events and more variability in weather patterns, but you can also have both of these at the same time. You can have a heat event in June, July, followed up with some rain in September, and the damage to the fruit from the heat stroke can make your mold event even worse in September. So what can we do is the question. I'm going to look a little bit about grape diseases, and then practices for mold, reds and whites, practices for heat stroke, reds and whites. I'm not going to talk about viticulture. Mark did a fantastic job talking about viticulture. So no row orientations, no spray management, no canopy management. There's a wealth of knowledge out there of people who are very well qualified to talk about these things. So first up, this time last year, I was in North Carolina presenting at Surrey Community College, and I was doing a harvest seminar. I was doing actually yeast and fermentation management, and Mark Hoffman from the University of North Carolina came along and started talking about pests and diseases in North Carolina. Now, arguably it's quite different there. California is indeed blessed with great weather for the harvest season in general. North Carolina, by contrast, has about 5 inches of rain in July and another 5 in August. Temperatures spike about 5 degrees hotter than Napa County in July. And yes, while I was there, it did rain and it was hot. But he did present a whole bunch of shots. So when I think about botrytis, I also think about all of these other diseases that can affect us. Okay, so this one in particular, this is bitter rot. This is black rot, the after effect of black rot. Some of these you may have seen. I think the folks out in the Finger Lakes may have seen a lot of these. The East Coast folks will definitely have seen these. California, less common. Downy mildew, for example, not common at all in California, but it's out there. This one here, Phomopsis, definitely is an issue in California. And then there's two, the top left, we have bird's eye rot, anthracnose. You can see a little where it got its name from. This one up the top here is Macrophoma. That I think is the most disturbing of the rots that can happen in the vineyard. So we're not talking botrytis, we're talking lots of different things that can happen. This one on the bottom right is ripe rot. And then on the top left, again, we're looking at sour rot. And when I got into the industry, I did my studies, my undergrad in Australia, and worked primarily in California, my understanding was basically there was botrytis and nothing else. But there's a lot of other diseases out there. Sour rot, for example, comes from Aspergillus alternaria, Penicillium, and Rhizopus, plus Acetobacter's in there, which is when you walk into your rose, which is why it smells like vinegar. Disturbing stuff. What you're most likely to see, though, in California is these two. This is nice. Well, it's a good photo of botrytis. And this is what's going to give you your loss of terpenes in the aromatic whites, your loss of the botrytis-produced esterase activity, which can break down your fermentation esters. You're going to see mold characteristics such as geosmin and octanone coming through into your wines. In the reds, we also see degradation of anthocyanins and proanthocyanins, so a loss of color. So there are definite issues that can happen should you have these untoward wet events leading up to crush. Of course, you could also do this. Going back for a few seasons here, this was 2006. 2006 was characterized by something like half an inch of rain in mid-September, followed by some cool, dry weather. Another rain event about a week later, followed again by some cool, dry weather. And then another rain event, a third rain event in mid-October. And basically, the Chardonnay completely melted. And it was, everybody basically picked their fruit as quickly as they possibly could. This particular block was left to hang out to make a dessert wine because basically those rainfall conditions were classic Sauterne conditions, which was extremely appealing if you want to make dessert wines. Not that popular to be consumed, but certainly you can make great dessert wines with botrytis. Another one to think about there is 2011, and I think Randy mentioned that one earlier. There was a big dump of rain in mid-September where not a lot of fruit was ripe. And basically, again, the Chardonnay in the North Coast melted, and there was a huge botrytis outbreak. And the reds seemed to be okay, but ripening stalled, and there was definite botrytis in the reds coming into the winery as into October. And anecdotally, it's you ask the old guys if these weather events have happened before, and the general consensus was no. These are all new events that are happening. These are unseasonal, unpredictable events. Okay, so the point of my presentation, what do we do? What do we do with this fruit that comes in? Now, the first thing, I'm going to talk about botrytis first. And the good thing about botrytis, well, good and bad, it's been happening for centuries. And there's a lot of research that has been done on botrytis. We know a lot about it. For example, nutrition. Botrytis consumes nitrogen that's in the grape juice. So we know there's going to be a nitrogen deficiency. Vitamin B1, vitamin B6 are both degraded by botrytis. So we know we're going to have deficiencies there. And also one of the prime treatments for botrytis is sulfur dioxide. And we know that very high levels of sulfur dioxide can damage thiamine content. So we know a lot about the facts about how botrytis works. Sunburn, I'll talk about that later. We're less aware of how that all works in terms of biochemical changes in the berries. So we have some science, which is great. First up, what do? Add sulfur dioxide. Interestingly, sulfur dioxide really does nothing against lacase. Lacase is one of your main enemies in botrytis. It's the enzyme that causes browning in white wines. It's the enzyme that degrades color in reds. SO2, whilst it makes us feel good adding it, it doesn't actually knock out lacase. But it does stop the damage from other molds, other mildews, other non-Saccharomyces species, the damage from the other microbes that are in your must or your juice. So start out with the start out with SO2. The second thing, add tannin. Now tannin does affect lacase. Tannin is a phenolic compound, interacts with enzymes, proteins, and they basically inactivate it. This concept comes up a couple of times in this presentation, but it'll definitely knock back the the lacase activity. The more lacase you've got, the more lacase units, the more tannin you can add. And of course, with whites, you can add less because you're going to have phenolic characteristics in your wine. But that's your first remedy. Reds and whites, add SO2, add tannins. So now I've got a couple of slides on red wines, and then I've got a couple of slides on white wines. We'll do reds first. Lacase, again, lacase. Lacase is an oxidative enzyme. So you want to avoid oxidative processes. For example, don't do a cold soak. Yes, for sure, you can blanket it with CO2, etc., but it's still an oxidative process, okay? So you want to mitigate the damage that lacase can do. The second thing you want to do is stabilize your color. Note there, I've got two things there. We're adding tannin and we're adding an enzyme. Now there's two different processes involved here and they're separated. Like I said earlier about tannins interacting with enzymes to knock them out. With red wines, you want to stabilize your color. You're going to do that with a color stabilizing tannin added at the 1/3 mark of fermentation. That's going to mitigate the effects of the lacase on your color damage. But the second thing you're going to do is you're going to add an enzyme which will help filtration and break down the glucans. Botrytis produces a lot of glucans. They're long strands that can interfere with filtration. They're not really an issue when you're during fermentation. They're not an issue during racking, but come filtration and bottling, they can become an issue. And the beta-glucanase enzyme that breaks down glucans works best in an aqueous medium. So you want to get that in earlier, but you want to make sure you don't add it at the same time as you're adding any tannin because they're going to cancel each other out. Okay? So, second part. Now, I mentioned earlier about oxygen. In red wine making, oxygen is a very beneficial addition to red wines, softening tannins, polymerizing, etc. And most of the work we do when dealing with botrytis is trying to balance out dealing with the damage that the botrytis can cause and maintaining your best winemaking practices. So in this situation, with a lot of botrytis in red wines, don't add oxygen. Prevent that. The goal is to get your lacase level down to 0 as quickly as possible and prevent any further damage. And the way to do that is to just avoid oxygen. Okay. Second part of that is mouthfeel products. Now, yeast-derived mouthfeel building products are fantastic for rebuilding that palate structure that you've lost because of the loss of aromas and the loss of the phenolic compounds. Okay, so they're a very beneficial addition. So that's dealing with red wines. And the goal is to finish your wine and mitigate the effects, the damage of the botrytis, and make your best wine possible. Same applies to white wines. Now, this one was, we had a conversation earlier this week with the team, and we were talking about bentonite. Now, bentonite is one of the most common one of the more common, I should say, recommendations for dealing with botrytis. Now, it's not on this list. It's not actually in our protocol. And the reason is the goal of bentonite is to settle your solids in your juice to the bottom and take out the lacase is generally associated with the solids, settle them to the bottom of the tank and rack the clean juice off the top. That's totally viable. But you actually get a better effect by using an enzyme, which is going to break down the pectin chains inside your juice and allow the settling to happen and allow more solids to settle to the bottom and more of the lacase to be able to be removed from the tank, from the juice as leaves. So you're looking at a balance there. Do I use bentonite or do I use an enzyme? You can't use both, but if you're going to use one, you should use an enzyme. And definitely go on the high side with enzymes because one of the activities of botrytis is it starts to break down the cell wall. And the cell wall is where the pectins are. So more pectins are released into the juice when you have botrytis. So go heavy on enzymes. Other things you can do with white wines, basically you've got 3 goals, okay? three goals with reds and with whites. You want to mask off flavors. If you possibly can, you don't want a moldy tasting wine. The second one is you want to remove the glucans so that you can actually filter your wine. There's nothing worse than actually getting your wine to the bottling line and you realize you have to change out your membrane every hour. And the third thing is to build mouthfeel. Kind of build your wine back up so that it has some depth and some texture. Worst case, last chance, not really the last chance, but octanone and geosmin, which are formed from botrytis, they're some of the moldy characters. You can remove them with activated carbon. Geosorb is the trade name. Of course, you are using activated carbon, so your best bet is to try and remove them with untoasted oak during fermentation. But Geosorb does the job. It removes some of those characteristics. Yeah, that was botrytis. And I'm going to say this again when I conclude this, but what we do at Laffort is we think about fermentation and stabilization pretty much the whole year. It's what we do. So when you have either rot or sunburn or any of these issues, don't hesitate to reach out to us because we have all of these protocols. We can answer all these questions. We don't expect you to memorize everything I'm saying right now, but just reach out to us and ask questions, okay? Okay, now sunburn. That was a quick run through botrytis. Sunburn, again, we're not talking about viticultural practices. We've had some good discussion on viticulture earlier in this piece. We're talking about what we can do to mitigate the damage in the winery. And sunburn, I feel like I'm just adding some extra slides to the knowledge of unpredictable weather. And indeed, the key point for this slide is what Mark said earlier. At 105 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when tissue damage occurs to your grape berry. That's when the waxy cuticle starts to break down. That's when you're basically going to start to get dehydrated berries, breakdown of phenolics, etc., etc. So that's a key part. Now, sunburn is less well known. It's known, but less well understood scientifically. There's a lot of issues that happen, but not as much research has been done. But I'll give you an example of what has been done. Anthocyanins. We know that red fruit inside a very heavily shaded canopy in a hot climate is probably going to have no color because grapes need sunlight to synthesize it and produce anthocyanins. And we also know at the same time that red grapes on the outside of the canopy will get fried by the sun in a hot climate. So there's some viticultural issues there to work out, and we know that sunlight does affect anthocyanin synthesis and degradation. But some of the other stuff is less well understood. So what we can do when we look at our recommendations, we take into account what we do know and what we can see to mitigate the issues. So the picture on the right there is a sorting table. It's actually at Paul Moss Winery in Napa. It runs at about 1 ton an hour, and there's about 15 people, I think, that work on that line. It is commercially not viable for most wine production. It does a great job, berry by berry. They can remove all sunburn. However, that's not to say you can't take a hand pass through a large vineyard and drop sunburnt fruit, exposed fruit on the ground, and then run through with a mechanical harvester and harvest all your fruit. You could actually take a block of fruit that is substandard if you included the sunburn, but if you drop out that sunburned fruit, you could actually get a wine that is of decent quality, serviceable wine. Okay. Another thing there is keeping it clean. Sunburn damages fruit. You get more spoilage microorganisms, so you want to take care of your hygiene. Okay, that's always a key part, but more important when you have damaged fruit coming in the wine. So white wines, it's interesting. A lot of these slides are very product centric. Okay, yes, we sell products, but the key is what we're doing is we're substituting a physical process for an alternative. Okay, so for example, pressing. If you look at that fruit there, do you really want to squeeze that fruit to 2 bar and actually extract all that juice? You probably don't. but you still want a commercial yield. So what you can do is you can use a pressing enzyme, which is going to help free up the juice within the nice berries at a lower pressure and give you a higher yield at a lower pressure. And that's the goal of a lot of these products, is to mitigate the damage and to improve the quality of your wine and the yield of your wine when you get to the end of the day. Red grapes. Just the main thing here for me is that I admit I've only recently discovered yeast-derived mouthfeel products. I think they're fantastic. You can build up texture and mouthfeel, and especially when you're in a situation where you've had botrytis, you've lost aromas, you've had sunburn, you've lost aromas, you've got phenolic damage. You can actually rebuild the mouthfeel of the wine and bring it up to a higher quality level. Of course, if you have rot, you can just make dessert wines. I recently went to Ikem in Sauterne, and they have some great photos of what moldy fruit should look like. This looks great. As I said earlier, though, not a lot of people do actually drink dessert wines, unfortunately, but they are some of the best wines in the world. We'll do our best to convert them. Okay, so that wraps up the presentation. What I covered was pretty much in the winery, how can I deal with fruit that's been damaged by rot or by sunburn? Now, like I said, we don't expect you to remember all this stuff. Please reach out to your local Laffort person, because they do remember all this stuff. They can actually help during crush when things happen. And being prepared for this is part of the battle as well. So know where to go. So I want to thank Daniel for hosting this. He's doing a fantastic job. I'd also like to thank Caitlin, who's managing all of the transitions in the background, and it's going incredibly smoothly. And I am looking forward to seeing the rest of the presentations. So with that, I'll hand you back.